Okay.
Well, I guess it's a much more complicated story now that I think of it. Though at the time I made the various decisions to take up an academic career, one thing flowed into another without much hesitation. As a and it, you know, I suppose you can say the story begins because I was at the University of Toronto. I was 17 into a thought I would do anthropology, would not be really excited very much about Native Americans, although I know that is no longer the case, but at the time. And next door to the anthropology department was a door that said Islamic Studies. And so I thought, wow, Arabic, why don't I learn Arabic? This way I will never have to be a high school teacher. Which you can imagine. This is the intelligence of a 17-year-old. In any case, having gotten my degree from University of Toronto in Islamic Studies, again, I now, 4 years later, I made a decision that on one hand, I would apply to do Ottoman history at Harvard, and I would do history of art at Michigan. Completely different directions, I suppose. Whoever was nicer to me, I would go there. In any case, at the University of Michigan, I already with a background in Islamic studies. At the time, I had studied Arabic and Turkish and various kinds of histories, economic history, and what. I then actually delved into art history for a master's. Then moved to Harvard in any case because I married somebody who was MIT and completed what was then a fine arts degree, but history of art, but they called it artes elegantes. In fact, my diploma says artes elegantes, which is hilarious. To do it, I did field work by studying a town in Iran and its architectural history in the 14th and 15th century. But all the while, also while at Michigan and at Harvard, I was a member of an archaeological team that worked in Syria on a site that was an early 8th through 14th century site. And that is, so I already was kind of ambidextrous. On one hand, I was doing architectural history. On the other, I was actually doing medieval archaeology. And one thing led to another. And again, I suppose one could say that it wasn't all thought out. I had the opportunity to start a field project in Iran on architectural history and urbanism, and also to start another project in Morocco on a rather similar topic. What changed direction for me yet once more was the opportunity in the late 70s to actually work on contemporary architecture in the Islamic world when I was invited to actually be the organizer of the Aga Khan Award for Architecture. And so I was confronted with dealing with the past in present and also to deal with architectural history for architects and not only for historian, cultural historian, or art historian. So that basically, from being ambidextrous, I actually then developed yet a third hand, so to speak. And so as a result, I actually changed my specialties over time, several times, dealing on one hand with archaeology, on the other with architectural history, and then in two different locations and in two different periods. Now you might ask, well, what does this have to do with my study of the nomad? Because of course, what came to the Vincent seminar, speaking about a certain 13th century nomadic burial. Well, that in turn is connected, in fact, the beginning of my interest in this is connected with my undergraduate paper on the Pontic steppe. That is the steppe the grasslands that are directly north of the Black Sea. And I had at the time studied, done an undergraduate thesis, in fact, on an Arabic, a traveler from the center of the Islamic world at the time, who went north and in fact went all the way up to the Baltic. And you might know of this traveler in a different guise from a popular film that was called The 13th Warrior. And in fact, it was done up as a science fiction book, but it's not. It's actually a real text. So his name was Ibn Fadlan. Anyway, all things being put together, I now find myself again working on this area, which falls into contemporary southern Ukraine and southern Russia, and dealing with the 13th century focus. So that's how I got to Quinton's seminar. I don't know anything else that it's really up to you to ask me another thing.
It seems so much like a bunch of accidents as you describe it. And kind of, here's a very gifted person who goes through one door, and inside that room there's another door, and you go through that door, and that's a pretty interesting room. And is there any necessity in this process, any sense of being driven by something, or is it really, as you say, a matter of just, I got into this place, and there were some opportunities, and I took one, and that led me to some other opportunities? I mean, how do you see that, the kind of glue that ties the story together?
I wish you could tell me. I know that I have a very high, I get bored quick. So once I have figured out one thing, I always want to start something else. And so this gave me an opportunity to actually launch myself into several other projects consecutively. And they, I suppose, are connected. I come back to old projects as well. So it's not as if I forget them. I mean, sooner or later, you know, that thing comes up because I happen to deal with an item or groups of issues. For example, what is the nature of nomad versus settled experience? What is the nature of the way in which you have in-migration of groups, and what kind of trace do they leave on the landscape? That turned out to be actually one of my interests, believe it or not. And so as an architectural historian, I've also veered into actually the history of landscape as such. And so I see these really as kind of interconnected spheres of interest. One thing I've not worked on specifically is actually painting. So for me, it's space, use of space, making of space, traversing space, the marks of somebody's making space on the landscape, that kind of thing, that actually probably is the macro issue.
I share with you this kind of this intolerance of boredom. I suppose that's why I'm going to be interviewing a zookeeper tomorrow in this space. I mean, you know, it's kind of extreme. But I wanted to ask, I mean, one of the areas I'm most afraid of is to be reincarnated as an archaeologist.
Really?
Because my fear is that then you have to focus on this piece of real estate for a very long time and dig through many layers of dirt and irrelevant stuff to get a few insights, and it feels like being nailed down, but that must not be your experience. You couldn't stand to be involved with archaeology.
No. Because you see, I was lucky enough to, my first involvement with archaeology was actually a project that had a very definite time limit. Okay, so it began in at a certain moment, and it stopped at a certain moment, and then there was the publication. Now, I understand that there are many archaeological museums that are filled with dug up stuff that has never been published. Okay. But in this particular case, it was actually, this was a project that was run by Khalifa Bar. It was a site that was an early Islamic site that had two different versions of itself. One up to the 10th century, and then a kind of recrudescence in the 12th through 14th century. And we published it, very quickly, considering all other archaeological publications. So, and it was also one that did not apparently have any earlier. So it was very much founded in 727, and then abandoned after this foundation was abandoned. There was a kind of recrudescence in the 12th century, and very much abandoned because Mongols had destroyed its trade zone along the Euphrates. And so it was actually very good to begin to understand, okay, we understand this site. It had really two major phases. We explained them. And so my experience of archaeology was quite well-framed and very efficient. And so it's not, you can't imagine that this is this huge town somewhere that, hundreds of years of excavation will be going on. They'll never figure it out. And I think that a lot of the best thinking in archaeology actually happens when you have fairly limited campaigns that just say, okay, let's figure out, for example, this place of places that you're looking at, or this time, and then you work on that, and then once you do it, you declare it finished. Now, what's interesting, this particular site that we worked on has since been revisited by somebody completely different, and who has decided that what we had suggested, some of it was okay, and then other things he corrected us, and that's fine. Luckily, we did not excavate the entire site. Archaeology is destructive, right? So we only excavated an optimum, and then we could be checked. So this is why some archaeological sites are more yielding of thinking about society than others that just keep on going just because out of inertia. And I think most contemporary archaeologists would say the very same thing, that you need to have a campaign, you need to actually outline what it is that you want to do, and once you've done it, get it out so that other people can share it. But don't pretend that this is your entire life on one little site. So that's the key thing. You have to have a series of questions that you're going in, rather than any old thing.
This is fascinating. I now think maybe I could be an archaeologist. Apart from the fact, if I had the talent and such. But could you describe a little more sort of how you come to a campaign with respect to or how you came to a campaign with respect to this site, how you decided what limited thing you were going to do?
Okay, let me, the first site I was talking about was the one where I was not the director, and so I was simply, an apprentice and learning how to do it. But let me talk about the ones that where I actually had an idea and, was, okay, so the next, I think, major site that I worked on was actually not a site, it was actually an archaeological survey of an entire island. And I did this together with another colleague. The island is Jerba, off the coast of Tunisia. And I did this with two other colleagues, one a Tunisian, Ali Dreen, and Elizabeth Fentress from Rome. And we set out to survey the entire island by walking it, doing a walking survey, which effectively meant we mapped a stratified random sample of the territory. And on the basis of this, we're able then to determine what were the different phases of settlement on the island, how they were, similar to another, or how they differed. And we found out some really interesting things. Now, we started the project in '94. We finished the field work in 2000. And then we now published the first volume in '09, and the second volume is just about done. So that pretty well gives you what, and I suppose if we were working on it nonstop, full-time, we would have published it earlier. But that is a very good record. Now, what did we find? Okay, here's this island in the classical period and the up to the late antique, meaning up to the end of the Byzantine period. This was an island that essentially made its money making the purple dye, murex. And since murex is stable, you have to actually dye the wool immediately and then sell dyed goods to various locations in the Roman Empire, mainly Rome, and then, and of course, once Rome disappeared as a major consumer, their fortunes really went downhill. In any case, but what finished them off, apparently, was the fact that during the reign of Justinian in the 6th century, there was the plague. It actually spread through ports, and so the major port on the island called Menanx was essentially decimated, and of course probably also lost its specialized population that were making these dyes, or this dye. So the subsequent history of the settlement of the island is actually quite different. So it changes, the entire settlement pattern on the island changes dramatically. So my field, that is the medieval and early modern part of the settlement pattern, shows an influx of completely different people coming from the pre-Sahara oases of Africa, living in very different kinds of settlement patterns, very much oasis settlement patterns, and developing an entirely different kind of industry. Mainly, these were tree growers, so obviously they come from oasis, so trees were date palms, but mainly olives and fruit trees. Processing the olives in particular, selling their oil to places like Sicily and Venice, and also building in a very different way. Whereas the Roman late antique people had lots and lots of extra income, and therefore you have marble from every quarry in the Mediterranean. The tree growers, build in a very different way. I think we figured it out. I mean, one territory, the same climate, the same kind of water situation. I mean, nothing of that changed dramatically, but really very different use of territory. And so this is basically what archaeological survey can give you, supported by key test trenches. That is a project where I was very much in the direction of it, and I think we figured it out. So that's the project that finished, that is the field part of it, finished 12 years ago, and we're now working on the second publication of the second phase. And then the last project on which I actually talked at the Winton seminar was one that I got involved with, again, because somebody talked to me about these amazing finds that were found in southern Ukraine. And this was a person who came to pen that on Fulbright, saying, we excavated this very interesting medieval site, but the excavators are not art historians, nor do they have any special in medieval stuff, but they would like to apply for a Getty grant. And so we actually got a Getty collaborative grant, And on that basis, I put together a team that included a specialist in Byzantine material, myself, a historian, and of course the two excavators. And so that involved a grave goods of what appeared to be a nomadic prince, and grave goods a snapshot of early 13th century court culture in Europe and the Mediterranean. Why is this? Am I saying this? Because the person who was buried there was buried still according to ancient Turkic custom, so must have been either a pagan or at least was treated in this fashion. Was buried with Byzantine robes, with material coming from Rhine Valley, southern Syria, a lot of material from the various principalities in the north, so-called Rus principalities of Kiev, Halych, and Pereyaslav. And in itself, it's a kind of a time capsule of the moment. Think of the Latins are, the Crusader Latins end up, the Fourth Crusade, rather than going to the Holy Land, ends up in Byzantium. So this is really the same time. So this then allowed me to reactivate my knowledge of way back of the Turkic world, the steppe, all of this, and now I'm looking at it as an archaeologist as well as an art historian, be able to actually figure out what was where.
I want to go back to your island survey for a second. I'm just trying to imagine how this worked. It was a walking survey. I mean, did you dig holes?
Okay, so let me just explain how this works. So you have a territory, and you want to figure out what are the remains on the ground. Now, in the Mediterranean, it's fairly easy to do because, of course, there's very little vegetal overgrowth. You could not do this as efficiently in an area that has a very heavy vegetal coverage. But there, it's actually the vegetation is fairly sparse, so that as you're walking, you actually see all of the remnants or ruins. So what you do is you do a stratified random sampling of the territory. What does this mean? That you essentially take the territory, which in this case is about 21 kilometers by 23 kilometers. You divide it up into kilometer strip, running simply and arbitrarily north-south, and every fifth kilometer, every fifth strip, you walk by essentially having a team of 5 walk a square of 100 meters. And so you start walking, and as you're walking, you actually note everything that you see on the surface. So, for example, you pass a ruin of a house, okay, and you map that. You see in the field, because of plowing, there will be all kinds of ceramics scattered in the field. Ceramics don't walk away. Ceramic shards don't walk away. If something is broken, it's just left in the field. Yeah? So you then are able to map per square, per kilometer, per the 100-meter square. Yeah. What is there? So, for example, you say, okay, this is clocking in, and since you know the ceramics already, you know the chronology, the typology, you say, this square is clocking in as an early Roman presence. Means somebody in the Roman period was utilizing this territory, of that square. And you carry on like this until finally you've walked this entire strip from one end to another of the island. This allows you, and if you come at a larger ruined site, you actually stop, you do a closer survey, you map it carefully. For example, you find a ruin of a temple or a mosque or a house. You map it as best you can from the standing ruins. You look very carefully to see how many periods are represented in the detritus there. And then you carry on. So over the various seasons that we were there, we were able to actually, we mapped something like almost 400 separate sites. Now, we also did test trenches. Why? Because we wanted to be able to find out what kind of time sequence we could find at any particular place. So in selected locations, we would actually sink a test trench, never larger than, I don't know, 5 meters by 5 meters, to see how many layers we could find. So one thing on top of another, on top of another, on top of another. That ties into what we find in the field. So together, this allows us then to say, okay, so during the early Roman period, middle Roman period, late Roman period, late Antique I, late Antique II, everybody liked to live along the seashore, right? And they had maritime villas. We found several remnants of villas with mosaics, what have you. Okay, but this meant that the seas around the Jerba were patrolled, and therefore people could just have open villas. It's a different situation if you have pirates, right? So what happens to the population when, in the, let's say, from the 5th century to the 7th century, nobody controls the seas around? So you're not going to want the population doesn't want to stay in these open villas. They're going to retreat inland. And in fact, that's exactly what happened. And it's on the basis of how we can date the site that we then make this determination. Is that clear?
I think so, but it's sort of amazing to think that all this stuff is kind of just on the surface there, pretty much just on the surface, and all this information is almost readable from the surface of the island.
Well, it's true, it is readable, and of course, this kind of technique has been perfected for Italy as well, and also many other places in the Mediterranean, and anywhere where you do not have jungle, overgrowth. So, for example, in Central America, it would be much more difficult. Although it's also done there, you have to actually do, chopping away of vegetation and the rest. The main thing to remember is a sherd does not fall from the sky. Okay, a piece of pottery is left where it used. Now, for example, let me expand on this. Let's say you have a pottery kiln that makes amphora for transportation of olive oil, which is, obvious, right? This is what they grow, and therefore they'll be making containers right there on the island. So a kiln site is clear if you walk by it. Why? A kiln burns thing, has a lot of wasters. Wasters never move anywhere because, of course, they don't even bother moving it. Okay, if let's say you have a kiln full of amphora, and for whatever reason, it fires badly. You don't have enough fuel, and so they simply slump, or you can't use them. So essentially, you just dump on the side there. And so us coming there, 2,000 years later or so, we'll then see, yes, this was a kiln site, and it was making this and this type of amphora, and here are all of these that were dumped there. So kiln sites are actually very easy to find in the landscape, as are, let's see, anything that produces slag. So any kind of metalworking areas, and you begin to be able to distinguish one from the other. Old ports, because you have landings, the remnants of repacking, all of this. People utilize these areas in very different ways, and once they abandon it and withdraw, then an archaeologist coming much later, can actually try and reconstruct the manner of life. Now, what's interesting in this island is that we have at least two completely different systems. One, the early one, which essentially was a monoculture only making dye, murex dye, extremely expensive. And so they were essentially consumers of everything in the Mediterranean. So we have remnants of amphora that came from Gaza, that came from various islands in Greece, they built with, as I said, with marble from every quarry there was around the Mediterranean. These were people that were living high on the hog, okay, off the hog. The next period was some totally different. These people come in from the oases of the pre-Sahara. They are much more orchard tree growth types, and their product is olive oil. Okay, so they are trading a very different kind of commodity that, granted, they can live by selling, but they're buying wheat to sustain the population, and so you have a very different kind of exchange. They certainly don't make a lot of cash. Okay, this is more of a barter trade. So, and this of course gets you into the issue of what is the economy of the Mediterranean at any one time. How does it change? And we know that it does change. So,
I'm imagining this process as you come to the island knowing a whole lot of what sort of thing you're going to find, knowing a whole lot about its basic history, about similar sites, stuff like that. And given that knowledge, your survey sort of fills in the particular holes for this island. Is that right?
no, actually not.
Okay.
We did not know that, we did not, yes, the framework we have, okay, there was such a thing as the Roman Empire, and there was such a thing as the Islamic empires, one after the other, and so on and so on. But, and of course we have historical record, written records, etc. What we never knew, and what we did find out, for example, is the fact that we have a change of populations. We have a virtual collapse of the population at the end of the 6th century. I mean, the number of sites, when you compare the ones that we could date, let's say at the height of the Roman period, Middle Roman period, and at the end of this process, is it's something like, I don't know, 200 versus something like 25. So you can actually see the difference in the use of territory, and then a rise of a completely different use of territory in the later periods. And so that is not noted in any history. Okay. Plus the fact that historians write within a framework of for whom they're writing. So, you know, if you have the annals of, let's say, the Christian church, you know, there are one bishop after another, or if you have annals of, I don't know, one caliphate after another, they don't necessarily track the use of territory. They talk about, you know, rulers and who they fought, and, you know, what kinds of things that were created from one place to another, and not necessarily Jerba. There is no text, medieval text that deals with, or let's say even Latin text that deals with the history of Jerba. Nobody at the time sat down and wrote such a history. That was not of interest to those type of historians writing then. But in addition, we also, by doing this kind of archaeology, we deal with the use of territory, the kind that you would find in archives. See, if you wanted to do a history of Philadelphia, all you had to do is actually go to City Hall, find out, you know, who was living in my house from what time to what time to what time, and be able to reconstruct it. That you don't have on the island of Jerba, but you can reconstruct something of it through this kind of method of survey archaeology.
When you go at a project like this, I mean, when you were sort of, before you came there, did you say to yourself, well, let's see, as the Roman Empire declined in power, there would be less possibility of defending certain sorts of establishments. There would be less possibility of marketing certain sorts of products. I'm going to expect the Roman presence to somehow decrease, and I'm going to expect that somebody else is going to come in. I mean, was that sort of thought the kind of thought that you sort of went into the thing with?
Well, no, actually, you see, my colleague, Elizabeth Fentress, is the Romanist. She essentially connected with me because I deal with medieval and early modern periods. And so what is pretty typical for archaeology in North Africa is that you have people who are Roman specialists, and they really don't talk to people who are medieval ones. Okay? And so this project is interesting because, in fact, we connected to get all of these periods together. And what we found out, for example, is that under the Visigoths, right, that the Byzantines are holding this territory. I mean, the Roman Empire, i.e. the Byzantines, are holding this territory, and then they get displaced exactly by the Visigoths. And over that period of time, which is before the Byzantines retake it again, is the purple starts, they go crazy. They are just, manufacturing all sorts of purple. Why? Because the Visigoths are more Roman than the Romans, so to speak. They want a lot more purple. So it's actually counterintuitive almost. You wouldn't expect it, but in fact, that's exactly what happened. And when the Byzantines come back, they try very hard to maintain this territory, and are kicked out then by the first Islamic invasions. Then nothing happens for 2 centuries. We found hardly anything. So either we still can't explain why it is that in the 8th and 9th century, we either don't know how to recognize the material from that time, or exactly nothing happened. It's only with the 10th century that you have now the rise of this new settlement pattern. So therefore and because Islamic history is written out of Baghdad, right, or Damascus, who cares about this little island, off the coast of Tunisia? So here again is the issue that history, official history, just aren't interested in this. That is why, although you have a framework, the detailed microhistory is never available to you.
And that's what makes archaeology fun, is that you can tell a story that isn't there otherwise. Right. We were talking before about kind of larger thoughts and going back and forth between sort of very specific contexts and larger questions. Did your work on the island produce in you any kind of larger thoughts about landscape and things like that? I mean, I'm just interested in how an archaeologist's mind works and how you move back and forth between.
Yeah, okay. Remember that I'm also an architectural historian, so I actually deal with the concept of landscape as an anthropogenic thing. Okay. So here we have this. So for example, here we have this island, but in fact, exactly what I was telling you, that a space can be manipulated, even all other things being equal, completely differently by different social structures. Okay, and so that in itself is already a very major, question and issue that you want to pursue. So now turning exactly the landscape, playing the landscape card, we look at these grasslands. The current project that I'm working on. What are these grasslands? Does the landscape actually set the agenda, or do the societies that come into this landscape set the agenda? Okay, so on the island, it's clear that the island can, in fact, let's say, take 2 completely different usages of it. And still, it's fine, I mean, to this day. And in fact, if you look at it today, from the middle 60s to, recent, the third usage in one whole zone of Jerba has become, a vast touristic enterprise, where it received, all of these people coming from Northern Europe. Okay, so the same landscape utilizes, different strategies. The population on the island, let's say, utilizes different strategies depending on what's possible. Okay. Now we turn to the other project that I'm working on. So here is a completely different landscape, a grassland, Okay. And trying to understand why it is that a certain group of nomadic confederation decided that they needed to build a very large commemorative tumulus for their leader. What's fascinating here, and this landscape is one that is between the Dnieper Broad River and the Sea of Azov, this whole zone, where the right bank of every river is higher than the left bank. And on the right bank, you will find, the casual traveler finds any number of tumuli. That is burial mounds. Okay. Now, these burial mounds are not of the same period. They date very clearly from Bronze Age up to the 13th century. How is it that this landscape, right, calls on whoever comes by there? You know that this is an area of massive migration. This is an area through which a variety of groups of people migrated. Evokes a certain kind of response, architectural response, because these are structures, on the, in this territory, right through time. So it's the exact opposite of the island. It makes you think. Yeah? This is a completely different response. Now, you could say, well, it's a different society. Yes, it's true. The nomadic societies really utilize territory in a different way, memorialize some great leader or so on by essentially these. So who told them that in this landscape, this is what you do? If these are newcomers. This last group that we're working on, we know, still in, at the end of the 10th century, beginning of the 11th century, was actually way far east on the borders of China and had migrated all this way, ended up here in the middle of the 11th century. Sorry, I have a telephone. I just get rid of here.
Take your time. No problem.
And I have to find my damn phone. Yes. Okay. Sorry.
No problem.
Okay.
Well, I mean, I know the Minnesota grasslands, and the impression one gets when one's in the middle of what must have been there before, the white settlers came, is that it's just sort of hard to imagine how one would ever find one's way or navigate it. It's so much the same for hundreds of miles.
Well, it's really not, because first of all, you have water sources. You have change in relief. It's not all one, flat pan.
Well, I'm sure it looks that way. I'm saying it looks that way to me. It can't have looked that way to the people who lived on it, or they wouldn't have been able to, travel around on it. I mean, they would have gone crazy, I think, without landmarks.
But the question is, we always think, well, okay, here's this whole group, and they come in. Often the indications are that there are already some substrate populations in them. So you say, well, the Minnesota settlers, yes, but okay, but they had guides, okay? Who were the local guides? Somebody already, Lewis and Clark were guided by whom? Across, by Sacagawea or whoever. I mean, you always forget that somewhere there's a substrate population. So the same thing, if you look at the Eurasian steppe that extends from the Danube to, say, the Chinese Wall, Great Wall, there are people who are in power, and then there are the various substrate populations. For example, the ferrymen that have to ferry anybody across large rivers that are in between, for example. The remnant populations that just don't sort of move off are then included in the new order. So this is the way in which, at least I imagine, how a landscape, the rupture and continuity issue of social order actually functions.
So the people who are coming through were finding people who knew their way around, kind of postage stamp by postage stamp of land.
Well, and of course, would suborn them, or would have it, come to some kind of understanding, or would force them. I mean, all of these possibilities.
So, getting back to your question about these burial structures, kind of for whom or to whom are they a statement? Are they a statement for the substrate population? Look what wonderful things we are, or how do you read that?
Well, first and foremost, I think they are an expression of a particular society whose leader is being buried. First and foremost, because that society actually takes part in the obsequies. That is the first and most important thing to remember. And then and it has to do with the ritual of memorial. You know, we have our own rituals of memorial. These these artificial hills is essentially these kinds of memorials. But it struck me as interesting that this particular landscape is full of these memorials, even though the particular societies that had constructed them have long since disappeared. New ones coming in recognize this form being a memorial form. And that's a kind of a puzzle. I'm still puzzling over.
Can you say a little more about what the puzzle is there? That they kept building mounds? Is that the puzzle?
They kept building, the same sort of artificial hill. All of these, and what you actually consider this, that at some point this was territory that was inhabited by the Scythians. Okay, these are Indo-European, Iranian-speaking groups. Yeah, at some point these are now they disappear somehow. They disappear off the map. Then there are the Sarmatians, who are we know them from the various Latin chronicles. They are there. Then come the Huns, right? Then come the Avars, then come the Goths, then come the various Turkic groups. They all come through this territory, and all of them, one way or another, leave these kinds of memorials. Now, is it in their genetic code? Well, no, we know they're different linguistic groups even. So is it the landscape that engenders this kind of response? How do you actually understand this over time?
Well, I mean, one thing one might say is, I think about the Washington Monument. I mean, it's a bizarre thing. There's nothing like it. Why did it? Because somebody had the idea, the old guys built this sort of thing, we're just as good as they are, so we're going to build this sort of thing, only bigger, and show that our people are just as memorable as their people.
Yeah, it may be that too. So anyway, we are very fortunate in this particular instance because the actual tumulus was excavated very carefully. So, for example, we now have even the possibility through this computation called energetics to actually reconstruct how many people actually it took to build and how many days it actually took to build this tumulus.
And what is that like? I mean, how fast did these things go up?
Well, so let me just explain this science of energetics. You figure out what is the material that this tumulus is built of. Okay, it's built in a particular way, in such a way that you have ramparts of sod rolls, so grass sod rolls that are built up so that you in a circle, and then there is the area inside it is actually filled with just loose soil that is tamped down. And you have to, in trying to reconstruct how many people it took, how many days, also trying to figure, well, what kind of tools did they have? Did they have shovel? Did they have beasts of burden? Did they have cart? And in this case, yes, at all three. So then you look at any kind of, we have all of these statistics, labor statistics, 19th century. How long did it take to dig a ditch? This is all available. We were able to collect all of it. So we know that in this area, the soil is not workable until, let's say, from the middle of April to the middle of October, because otherwise it's frozen. So therefore, it's really a warm weather activity. And if that is the case, and we have, let's say, 150 days of warm weather possibility, and we know what the total volume of the mountain is. We know what the actual dimensions are of the sod ramparts. We can actually, determine very, very specifically. But the only question is, was it done all in one stretch? That is, they started in April and then kept on working, however many people it took until they finished in October. That's one possibility. So many person days, so many people working until they finish it. Or they know, actually, they probably did it in two phases. First phase, then a break, then the second phase. So it took many fewer people, but twice as long. So you have these alternatives that you think. Part of our aim was to try and understand, in a nomadic society, how many actual individuals could be free to do this kind of work. And, do all of these computations. This is basically what we're working on now.
Well, I mean, and the more you talk about it, the more puzzling it feels to me. I mean, in a city, there's always building going on. And
well, no, yeah, but
some
anyway,
kind of,
yes.
I'm thinking the skills are preserved, the organizational structures are preserved because somebody's building something.
Well, no, for example, on the island of Jerba, for example, we had a collapse, and so the old organizational structures disappeared. So in fact, not. But in this case, this is why I'm saying that on this mound, in the middle of the steppe, who are the actual people that know how to build this kind of tumulus? Are they the people that have come in, the new people, or is there a substrate population that are the tumulus builders? And so we have to actually model these two behaviors, because there's no text or anything that shows us either case. It's better to actually talk about both cases. So in this particular case, let's say that it's a fairly simple structure. All you need is, you need carts, you need oxen, because we know that they had both, and you need to be able to have salt. Okay? And you take that up, you simply cut salt from the grassland, and you start to build it up.
So is it imaginable that people could go, 40, 50 years without building one of these things, and then somebody dies, and there's a traditional memory of how to do it, and they get together and they make it happen? Well,
you see, here's the thing. Sod ramparts are a defensive structure, right? In their core. And in fact, we have in this entire territory, this is what you do. If you do not have stone walls, the next best thing is to actually build a rampart out of sod, right? Have a moat and then a rampart. So in this case, the tumulus utilizes that otherwise well-known structural capacity to build a rampart, except in this case, the ramparts are built in a circle rather than in a line.
So it's essentially just a variation on something that they would be doing pretty regularly or pretty often.
Some population would know how to do in this territory.
Nice.
Whether it is the particular population that belongs to this prince, or this nomad leader or not is something that I can't determine because I have no other indications. But apparently, if you actually look at this entire territory, there are many kinds of rampart structures that were otherwise available and noted.
So it's not mysterious how people could have erupted with these things when needed.
That's quite straightforward.
I see. What's it like to move from sort of architectural history and the study of other kinds of structures to these grave structures? I mean, does it feel like, simplifying down, or I mean, how does it? You've got these two enterprises going, one of which is working with two enterprises going that work with very different structures. I'm curious how that strikes you.
Actually, it's interesting because in the end, you look at any kind of structure in terms of its form, but you also look at it in terms of the kind of labors necessary to organize it. And so if you actually look at any, and so for example, I've studied, 14th century building in Iran, for example. You look at a building and say, okay, here's a building that has a dome, for example. Well, all right, so you have to have a dome specialist, a vault specialist to build this. But the rest of the walls can be built by almost anybody that's a farmer who would know how to build a wall. But so you have the combination between very expert know-how and this regular farming know-how, and the two come together in some way. And of course, then but when you change scale, you actually have to change expertise. So a very large structure, all the very large structures in the pre-modern world, in pre-modern, let's say, Asia, are actually connected one to another. Every dome is a model for the next dome. You have to think of it this way. One way or another, even if we can't make the chain of expertise because we lack the specific historic detail, we can actually assume that one dome stands there in the landscape and then is an inspiration for the next one. Yeah, it's like think of a different way of architecture. Think of all of the skyscrapers that we have. There is always a competition to build a bigger, taller one. So in the pre-modern period, there was always a competition to build a bigger and bigger dome, or a bigger and bigger structure. And in this case, only way in which you could cover such a structure would be through a dome. So part of my interest in the way in which people make structures, whether they're small or large, is in fact the difference between know-how that is very, very specialized and know-how that is sort of assumed to be local.
And if I'm getting you right, these mounds don't require anything very specialized.
Well, that's maybe not entirely true. This particular mound, which is probably one of the latest to be built, because after that, what happens are two things. One, this population, this steppe population, either turns Christian or Muslim, and in both cases, they no longer build mounds. Okay, so the 13th century is pretty well the last hurrah for this sort of thing, and then it goes backwards and backwards. Under the Scythians, for example, actually had a stone structure inside, and that certainly required, a much higher capacity of structural capacity. There had to be a specialist to do this. Whereas these later medieval mounds actually are just used sod ramparts.
I'm curious about your speculation about the question you raised earlier, why these things got built at all.
Yeah.
I mean, Wisconsin has mounds,
Yeah.
Minnesota has mounds. mounds keep showing up. What do you think about kind of the motive for mounds when it comes down to it?
Oh, I wish I knew. I mean, I think part of it has to do with the imaginary of these different societies. The transformation of a landscape by a society. There must be something along those lines. I mean, that there is an engagement with the way in which, and they're not necessarily for practical reasons. Okay, so this is one thing that we have to discount. And we know there are lots of structures for practical reasons, you know, irrigation works or dams or that sort of thing, or basic shelters for practical reasons. But none of these mounds are for overtly practical reasons. They are for memorial, imaginary, parts of the imaginary, so that any society, any human society, actually works not only to exist in the here and now, but actually in the then and there as well. And so, how to leave a trace on, you know, behind you. I think there must be something along those lines.
So you somehow or other attain immortality or show that you haven't lived in vain by making a change in what everybody's going to see and notice.
Yes.
Forever.
Yeah, actually, yes.
Thank you for your time.
Yeah, you're welcome.